Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us. So I'm Jamila. So I'm an artist and writer. I'm disabled and I tend to make work, um, kind of see my artistic practice as a way of processing my identity and my emotions and experiences. So around disability and around mixed race identity, the death of my dad when I was pretty young, like around the age of 3, um, and kind of, yeah, figuring all of those things out, the things that I don't necessarily have the language for in day-to-day life as an autistic person. And what this kind of talk is informed by is the research that I've been doing since around 2018 around disability within an arts context, thinking about accessibility. I think access work is kind of a really big part of what I do as an artist, both within my creative practice, but also kind of within infrastructures and working like outside of and within organizations to think about how disabled people, but actually everyone engages with art, and the different ways that people are locked out of art. So I'm going to focus today on creative access adjustments. So this idea of building access adjustments into our practices, like kind of from the conception, and that being another expansion and extension of the art form. So the art of access adjustments. So as I said, the focus of this idea around access adjustments, I'll go into some definitions in a second, but it's thinking about access adjustments as an art form, as a way of actually practicing through our access adjustments so that they're not just an add-on, they are something that are built into our artworks and our artistic practices. So this is very much informed by other disabled artists. I'm going to give you some examples. It's something that I've been thinking about as I started to move from kind of being, I was initially a writer and curator, and I started making visual work actually as an access adjustment because I wasn't well enough to continue doing the work that I was doing, and adapting to doing something that I could do from bed. So a lot of the work that I make from bed, and actually creating visualizations of the research that I'd been doing around disability. So that was also a way to then consider how access adjustments might be built in. But what I've found through my own practice and other people's practices is that there is something really, really imaginative and really curious about thinking about access adjustments as an art form. It creates a lot of freedom and flex and just possibility with our creative practices because it enables us to think through different sensory experiences, which can be a really exciting thing to do. To begin with, I'm going to think about how we're defining access, what accessibility means in terms of the arts. And throughout this, there are going to be some resources that come up. There's a full list at the end of the presentation. There are so many now access resources available online that have been created by disabled artists. When we think about disability and access in the arts, it really is the case that it's been coming from individuals and artists, from disabled people who quite often are entering into organizations, and when they leave, the organizations look pretty different than when they first came in. So this idea of actually, you know, disability giving you an awareness not just of your access needs but other people's access needs, and then thinking about how you might kind of integrate that into the spaces around you and open things up for other people too. So this guide, written by the American disabled artist Carolyn Lazard, who is a really phenomenal artist. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Carolyn's artistic practice later on, but Carolyn has been very influential on a lot of disabled artists and generally on the kind of infrastructures and contexts of disability in the arts for a number of years now. Somebody, if you research this further, whose name will come up again and again, I think it's 2019. Oh yeah, it is. Uh, Carolyn made this resource, which is available online. It's a guide, which when you go to this site is available as a kind of written document, or you can also have it as a kind of audio resource as well. So having those access adjustments built into everything that you're doing too. And it's a kind of step-by-step breakdown. It's very kind of informative. It's very kind of didactic of different access adjustments that can be integrated into organizations. And the intention of this, I mean, you can see the contents and is the middle image on this presentation slide is the contents. You can see it covers so much. So there are the things that you might be familiar with, like American Sign Language, which for us would be British Sign Language. If you are unaware of it already, sign language is different depending on, in the same way that language, we have different language, discursive languages, there are different sign languages based on the kind of context and locality that you're learning within. So this is focused specifically on American Sign Language. You have things like audio description, closed captioning. So those are the kind of access adjustments that you might be most familiar with, and I'm going to talk about what they are in a second. But also it's thinking about things like childcare, sensory rooms, and things like, when I was reading this, there were certain things that I hadn't thought about, but as somebody that came to a diagnosis, well, I'm not actually formally diagnosed, but of autism late in life, there's things like about scent, and that people have scent sensitivity to things like perfumes, and I'm somebody that has that myself, and I never realized, and I never had the name to it. So actually some of these access adjustments, it's not that it has everything, and it's made clear in this guide that it's been written by disabled people. It is comprehensive, but it's not extensive. It doesn't have everything that you could possibly have, but it does start to open up different ideas, and it both explains what those access adjustments might look like, practical ways to integrate them into the organizations, and then also how to do things like label and kind of, yeah, does that make sense? Like label what they are. So how to be instructional about what you're actually providing, how to communicate the access adjustments you have. So even though this is aimed at organizations, and actually the way that it's framed is to think about small organizations to begin with, it looks at the fact that a lot of small organizations will often model themselves off larger institutions that are historically quite inaccessible and colonial structures, as a lot of institutions in many forms, not just arts institutions, are. So it thinks about the fact that instead of modeling themselves off these bigger institutions that might not be using their resources to think about these things, how can you implement and integrate a different, more open approach with more limited resources? So actually, for artists as well, if you want to think about what you might integrate in your artworks, the different ways that you might communicate, the different access adjustments that you might use, going to this is quite a comprehensive way to go, okay, like, what might I think about? How might I do it? There is that practicality on kind of individual, and I mean, if you work collectively, on a collective level as well, that can be sort of framed for what you do. So an access or reasonable adjustment, what this refers to is, so in the Equality Act of 2010, it requires employers and service providers to make reasonable adjustments that will allow disabled people to access the same opportunities and services as non-disabled people. So some of those things are things like having step-free access to a building. If you're studying, it could be things like having extra time. It's having closed captions available on this talk that we're doing. And this kind of model of thinking about access, or the fact that we describe it as a reasonable adjustment, something that is reasonable to ask for, to advocate for, also is in line with this idea of thinking about disability through the social model of disability. The social model of disability is a kind of framework for thinking about disability, which basically says that a person is disabled because of physical and attitudinal barriers in society, as opposed to their disability. So, you know, I'm not disabled by the fact that I process information differently because I'm autistic. I'm disabled by the fact that I'm expected to fit into neurotypical ways of existing in the world. So instead of the onus being placed on the disabled individual, the onus is placed on society to actually try and take away those barriers, to make everywhere livable and make the world kind of hospitable for everyone. So I'm not going to go through every access adjustment that we could possibly have, because that would be the whole talk, which is another great talk to go to, but it's not what we're going to do today. So I'm just going to give a few descriptions of things that we're going to reference. So alt text is something that you've probably seen. So the description that's here is alt text is a written description of an image posted online. Alt text can also be added to images embedded in digital documents, PDFs, Word documents, Google Docs, presentations, etc. Alt text allows visual content to be accessible to people who are blind, low vision, or have certain cognitive disabilities. So the place that you might come across alt text all the time is on Instagram. The way that it's often framed on Instagram is that someone will put in the caption, they'll write something like ID colon, and then they will just describe in simple terms what is in that image. So if there was a photo of me now, like girl sitting in bedroom on her laptop, like it can be that simple. But the beautiful thing with alt text, and I'm not going to go into great depth with alt text today, it's something I've kind of focused on in the past, but there are some resources at the end. The artist Bella Milroy has created this beautiful zine that looks at alt text as poetry and as a kind of meditative practice. And what that guide gives you, it gives you kind of practical advice for how to write alt text, but it also gives you creative advice for how to write alt text. So the sense of how can we make this really creative, really imaginative. And so alt text can vary so much. When I've taught about it in the past, when I was lecturing, I would often do sessions where I would get the students to write alt text of the same image, and people come back with such completely different styles and ways of describing something, which completely shifts your experience of what that image would be if you're kind of experiencing it through the text as opposed to the visual. So then audio description, which is something that I've been focusing on more in the last year, is a service that narrates visual content to increase accessibility for the blind and visually impaired. It can also be helpful for people with learning and cognitive disabilities. For performances, this can take the form of live narration through a headset. Audio describers provide real-time narration, which connects to a headset for the audio describer user. For visual media, audio description can be incorporated as its own discrete soundtrack. So again, it's translating visual content into spoken, audible narration instead. And we'll go into a lot more depth with audio description, so I'll leave that there for now. And then closed captioning, which again, you might be very familiar with. You can think about it in the sense of like, you can put closed captions on in the majority of TV and film that we watch now. So closed captioning facilitates access for the deaf and hard and hearing impaired. hard of hearing. That's what the HOH in the brackets is, hard of hearing. It includes text-based transcription of dialogue and description of sounds, effect, and music. So again, we're going to have some examples of closed captioning, but this is another example of just like you can really, I mean, I now watch a lot of TV with subtitles because I found that for the way that I process information as an autistic person, it's really helpful. And it's quite interesting, you know, like some things that I watch habitually, like I watch Gilmore Girls on like a yearly basis, which is like, for those of you that don't know, is like an American sitcom from like the early noughties, which got revived more recently. So it's kind of been going for a long time. But the closed captions on that just aren't correct because I guess like they're from the early noughties, and there's a kind of idea in that the two protagonists, a mother and daughter, are really fast talking. So I don't know whether somebody made the decision that like they say too much, so let's just not put it all in the captions. But when you're somebody that can hear and is also reading those captions, the disparity between it is really vast. But also it's interesting, like if you're watching more contemporary stuff, the captions can still vary so much. Like you can see that in film and TV, there isn't a kind of style, like there isn't a simple like stylized way of doing it. How the captions reflect will be dependent on who has been hired to do it and their creative approach. And the way that it's always quite funny is like how people describe music. So, you know, it's like there are a lot of like default phrases that people will use, like ominous music or like haunting music, which sometimes as somebody that is hearing that music, like personally I like doesn't actually align. So as an artist, it's quite interesting to think about both how we might communicate what we're trying to do as an artist, like how are we going to translate what something that might be visual into something that's audible. Vice versa, if you're an artist working in sound, is there a way that you can translate that into something that is visual that can be translated to another sensory experience? And in that translation, you know, in the same way, something that I think is really beautiful about this and a really nice analogy is to think about translation of literature into different languages. That is a kind of art form in itself, that you know you have translators that are really commended for the work they do. You have the authors that always are translated by the same person, writers who have a translation practice and then go on to write books of their own. And there is something so creative in the language choices that they use, often to translate something. You know, in some languages there are phrases and words for certain feelings that then don't exist in other languages, and how do you then translate that across? Well, as an artist, that is something that we can also think about, this idea of access adjustments being a form of translation. And it really makes you think about what are you trying to communicate to the viewer, or not viewer, the audience. Sorry, you know, you can see with all of this that like it makes you think about the language you're using all the time too, and the default kind of languages that kind of privilege a certain way of experiencing the world. Um, but you know, what are the key kind of things that you want to get across? If something that you're working on is really visual, well, then how do you take the thing that you're communicating, whether it's a kind of feeling or experience or response? You know, you might not want to be that prescriptive in how an audience member like, you know, experiences your work. Well, if you don't, then what is it that you were trying to get across, and how do you translate that into different senses? So I think in that sense, it's like quite a freeing practice. So the work that I'm going to talk about first is one by Carolyn Lazard. It's one of the more recent works of Carolyn's, but I would recommend delving into Carolyn's practice in general. They work across many different mediums. I think I mean, I'm going to play you a little extract of a conversation that me and Carolyn had as part of this show, which has been toured in the US and to Nottingham Contemporary in the UK, and was shown last year. So we had a conversation as part of the show, and I think the way that Carolyn references their own practice is that they work in all mediums except they haven't really worked in painting. Um, which I think they were thinking about because the way that Nottingham Contemporary work is they do 3 solo shows at the same time, and one of them was a painting show by an artist who used to work in moving image. So yeah, there's a huge breadth of what Carolyn does. And Carolyn's moving image works, a lot of them are actually available to view online. So if you want to know more about what they do, a lot of them are really interesting conceptually around disability, but there's also some examples of moving image works that use creative audio description and use creative closed captioning that you can see online. This show in itself is so interesting to me because it essentially is a show that is based as its foundation around access adjustments. So the way that Carolyn was thinking about the show and something that they talked about throughout, which I think is a really brilliant way of articulating the ways that we access the world and work, is that Carolyn was discussing how within contemporary art and within art history, sight is always privileged. We always focus on sight as being the kind of most important thing and like the sense that we're considering first and foremost. And you can see that in the kind of shifts of sound practices becoming more and more part of the contemporary art world, but that wasn't always the case. So the visual very much being at the focal point. And what we lose in that kind of privileging and the way that that privileging of sight is also a colonial practice. It's a practice that overrides, the importance of things like oral history in knowledge sharing. So that it isn't to say that visual focus is something that is a part of all communities across the world. It is something that has become very institutionalized, that has become very colonial. And so this installation is all around dance. It's We do actually have an image here which I found of the show, but it is a show that does not lend itself and is not intended to be photographed or documented. Carolyn is very specific about the ways that their work is shared and communicated. Carolyn too no longer has any images of themselves as part of their work. You will not find, I mean, if you did some digging, you would find a photo of Carolyn, but like it's no longer part of their practice to share their face. So they're thinking a lot about disrupting some of the models of contemporary art practice, of like what we focus on the ways that we kind of the kind of celebrity around artists and the public image of an artist, but also the ways that we translate a show. Um, and so when I say the show is about dance, I mean, you're not going to look at that image and know that. But what it essentially did is that, so I'm pausing because it's like, it's quite it's quite hard to describe in a way. It's not that hard. Like when you think about it, it's not, but there's many facets to the show. So Carolyn worked with 2 collaborators who are friends of theirs. One of them is called Jaron Herman, who is a dancer, a choreographer and dancer. And what Carolyn wanted to do was to think about the legacy of dance, to think about the legacy of dance within the visual arts, and also the relationship of dance and the contemporary arts to access adjustments, because some of the earliest access adjustments that we kind of experienced around things like audio description and closed captioning were happening within contemporary dance, which if you want to know more about this, like it's worth listening to this conversation with Carolyn because they go into a lot more depth around the histories of the show, which are incredibly rich. Lazard is very, very much a research-based artist, so there is so much history that is being referenced all the time. Um, so what Carolyn did was they wrote an instructional dance score, what they called a dance score, where they essentially gave instructions to Geron that were then played for Geron in a room. Geron then had microphones strapped to their body and did a kind of I think it was quite an interpretive choreographed dance like in the room. I don't know how much of it was planned ahead of like choreographed ahead of time listening to the score, but it's all in response to the score. So then you're getting the movements of Geron audibly recorded. And then Carolyn sat down with a friend, Jacelia Rebecca Hughes, who is a poet, an artist, and the two of them wrote audio description of Geron's movements. So that audio description is audibly describing what watching Geron's movements look like. And so there is no visual representation of Geron in the room. A creative decision too, which means that in the kind of hyper visibility and the kind of the really difficult ways that the black body is kind of commodified, but also the kind of violence is enacted against black people in society. Geron as a black dancer is not visible. So there are all of these conscious decisions being made, you know, like in the same way as Carolyn as a black disabled artist. Like, what does it mean when we actually say we're not going to put our kind of ourselves visibly into these spaces? Instead, what you get when you come into the room is these three screens, which are CRT monitors. So these kind of box screens, three in a row. They all have captioning on them. The first one has captioning of the score, the dance score that Carolyn wrote, this kind of instructional dance score. The middle one has closed captions of Geron's movements. So like, you know, you can see on the screen it says scratch, scratch. And then the third one is closed captions of the audio description. What you are hearing in the room is a kind of soundscape of those three things all in tandem together. And so there is this visceral sense of there being a presence of a body moving in the space. You just can't see it. And that's really interesting because it creates this experience where you almost feel like, you know, Geron is just behind you or just out of view or just about to kind of come into the floor. The flooring, so like all of the different aspects of the installation are thought through in terms of they are all artworks in and of themselves. The vinyl flooring is an artwork called Surround Sound. So it's the kind of vinyl flooring that you would find in a dance studio, which takes on the marks that are made as you move across it. So what you get is all of the gestures and movements of the audience coming into the space. And then you have these benches that are situated around the room. So this is I think this installation view is in the US, but at Nottingham Contemporary, it's quite a big room and the benches are all situated at different points so that you can listen to, you know, you can sit and watch the screens or you can move and you can sit and listen to the soundscape at different points in the rooms, which will change your experience of it. And those are called institutional seating. And they are modified benches that are given like cushions and a back to make them comfortable. You know, one thing that you will see come up again and again in a lot of to say like it's quite a few disabled artists play with this in their work, the idea that there are never any comfortable seats to sit in kind of public spaces, but particularly museums and galleries. And those seats, each time the work is shown, there are new seats and they are then acquired by the space. So it's this kind of legacy as well of cripping the art space going forward. And when I use that term cripping, the term crip, as with the term queer, is a term that has been like reclaimed by disabled communities that would have previously been used as a kind of slur or derogatory term. When we use it as a verb like that to crip something, it's essentially to make it disabled, to make it disabled inclusive. There's problems with that word inclusive, but I can't think of a better one right now. So when we say cripping the art world, it's essentially making it hospitable and making it a kind of a space for disabled people. I'm not going to play the clip from Carolyn's talk now because I realize I just like talks for such long lengths of time and I don't want to run out of time. But come back to this conversation if you're interested. I'm not telling you that because I'm having a conversation with Carolyn. It is very much predominantly Carolyn's voice. But the way that they articulate about their practice is so it's just like mind bending, and it really expands the way that we think about things, I think. I find that as a disabled artist, but just generally in terms of the really, really in-depth research and curiosity and awareness around their practice is really such a brilliant thing. So there's also thinking about one of the works that I'm going to show you that I made recently was included in this festival in Ireland last year in Galway, Tolk Festival of Arts. This edition was curated by Irla Ní Fiúris, who is a disabled Irish curator who is also based between London and Ireland. And the whole festival was looking at disability and the histories of disability and the way that it has been kind of persecuted within Ireland, not unique to Ireland, but looking at the history specifically there. And one of the things that's interesting here is I'm going to look a bit at the ways that we communicate things remotely. So one of the access adjustments that has been really brought into, public consciousness through the pandemic is the sense of what do we do if we can't physically get to a space? And of course, that is not something that was unique to the pandemic, but it really brought it to everyone's attention. And when we say can't physically get to a space, that is both about like physical mobility, it could be about being immunocompromised, but it's also about financial capacity to get somewhere, geographical proximity, when things are London centric and everything's happening in London and you live outside of London or you live somewhere rural, well then how are you locked out of those things? So making remote documentation, not documentation, making kind of remote translations of artworks that go beyond just kind of straight installation documentation. It's quite an interesting thing to think about. So what I'm playing as I'm talking are these kind of short videos that Tolka made. They're each 30 seconds long, and they all translate this kind of experience of moving around the festival. So, these ones are focused on some of the moving image works that the festival had because there were many moving image works. So kind of taking the sound of them and kind of, editing together different clips of different artworks in quite an interesting way. So if you want to see them yourself, they're all available on Vimeo. When thinking about remote videos, the work that really, really informed and inspired me is one by Leah Clements, a London-based disabled artist. So this is Leah's show at East Side Projects in 2021 called Siren of the Deep, which was very much an installation-based show and artwork. So Leah often works in a kind of research-based practice around lived experience of like different kind of shared experiences, collective experiences that people might have. So in the past, she's made films about like the people that fall asleep when they experience stress. This show is about the feeling that happens when you're at the bottom of the ocean within diving communities, and it's this overwhelming pull to stay at the bottom. So Leah, and there is this kind of translation of kind of disability through a lot of these lenses. You know, even if it's not like really, really clearly underlined, there is a lot of consideration of what it means to be in a body, the different ways that we might experience the world, the kind of ways we might experience ease around it, challenges around it. So some of what we're hearing or reading in the oral histories is this sense of respite, of being at the bottom of the ocean and finding that you don't want to go back to being in your physical body and the kind of physical world. And so when you go into the room, what you're experiencing is that there is this massive inflatable pool, which you can see on the left. There is a soundscape of the oral histories. There is like a microclimate in the room because of the pool. So it's really kind of cold in this quite like, yeah, like quite manufactured way, like similar to what you might experience going to a swimming pool, but there is this kind of there is this specific atmosphere and climate that is created by the pool. And then in the corners of the room, which is the image you see on the right, are these light installations that are using like boxed mirrors and glasses and light kind of refracted through. So a really, really specific sensorial experience walking into this room. And what Leah wanted to think about was how to translate this into a remote moving image work for people at home. So this is the film of Siren of the Deep. You can see the whole thing online. It's 10 minutes long, but I'm just going to play you a clip of it. And in this clip, you get a sense of some of the different aspects that are used in the film.
Wow. Immediately understand why. Yeah. I feel great. Wow.
Why couldn't I have had this all my life? I just felt that times 1,000. You just stay down there. Imagine if I stayed here forever. That I felt could have been a trigger to losing it.
И каждый раз, когда возвращались снова в память, в сознание, конечно, мысль была одна. Вот опять возвратили, так сказать, в эти муки, вот в это состояние.
So you can kind of see there that I mean, Leah is somebody that has a moving image practice as an artist already, thinking about how is she going to creatively translate something that is an install into a film work so that it can be experienced in the same way at home. And so, you know, the ways that we're thinking about like the close-ups of certain aspects of the room, the ripples of water, how to kind of embody the what you're seeing like through a kind of moving image work, which is essentially a black screen with closed captions when you walk in. So if when you watch the whole thing, it's 14 minutes in length. So you know it is this kind of extensive, you know, it is quite a long work if you think about what you're getting if you get like traditional kind of install documentation of an exhibition, probably just getting static photos. Whereas here you're getting this experience of like being able to sit down with it. It might be similar to the length of time that somebody might spend in that room. And one of the things that Leah talks about is that so the length of this is in line with the 15-minute loop of the installation and the way that it works with the different lights, with the sound. Um, and Leah talks about, you know, you can stay in there and watch it as many times as you like. That there are these different moods that kind of exist within the film, these kind of euphoric highs in the oral histories of like you know, experiences of great awe and wonderment, but also like lows, like difficult things that are talked about, the kind of, I guess, like oppressiveness of being under the water as well. And that you can kind of decide whether you leave on a high or a low. Well, with this film, those things are still possible. You can sit and you can watch it as many times as you like. You can end and leave the film at whatever time you like. So there are these like translations of some of the key tenets to the experience Leah was hoping to create are also then embodied at home. So seeing this work made me think about moving image as a way to translate a physical install or a physical artwork into something that could be experienced remotely. And the nice thing about this is that there is also this thing within disabled artist communities, certainly in my experience, and I know that a lot of the people that I know working as disabled artists today would echo the same, is that whereas we often come across this kind of imposed like competitiveness that exists with artists, the limitation of you know, the limitedness of resources, just the ways that we kind of maybe work in solitary, you know, in a solitary way, and then we are pitted against each other to apply for the same like small amount of opportunities. And that combined with this idea in within the art canon and art history of like ideas being novel, and the idea of the artistic genius of like somebody doing something that has never been done before, which historically is often white and male and able-bodied. And actually, interestingly, like if you look at stuff historically, like some of the kind of pioneers of new movements, like the kind of minimalist movement, often were working through access adjustments. If there's that famous work of like a chair, it's like a photograph of a chair, a physical chair, and then a written description of a chair. Well, that is access adjustments. And it's not considered as that, and that work hasn't been like you know, positioned through disability in that way. But the thing that's really distinct that I found with disabled artists is that when you're pushing for access adjustments within the arts, you're pushing for more hospitable spaces for everyone. You want that to be extensive. You want it to be in as many different facets and as many different places as possible. So you're not looking at each other's work. Like when I saw this film, I didn't go, oh, Leah made a remote film of her show, Siren of the Deep. That's her creative license, and I can never do that. I went, that's a really interesting way of thinking about a creative access adjustment. This is the first time I'd seen it done in this way. I'm not saying this is the first time it's ever been done. I'm sure if you asked Leah, she would also tell you reference points to how she's got to where she is. But there is this experience of going, okay, this is opening my mind to different ways of doing things, and how can I then bring that into my own practice? And I think there is this element of, in the same way that we see all of those resources online, like the one that I showed you at the beginning that Carolyn wrote, and some of the resources that are included at the end of this presentation, there is this desire of knowledge sharing and bringing as many people into it as possible, because what happens when more and more people think about this is that we get more and more approaches to creative access adjustments, which are really interesting. So I'm going to show you in a second a remote moving image work that I made of a quilt I was working on, and also an audio description soundscape I made of it. When I proposed that work, as you all know, working as artists, like a lot of the time when you're making a work, you have to write a proposal for it and kind of submit it somewhere. And then, you maybe get it and the work gets funded to be made. And so I'd written this proposal to UAL for this work. The creative access adjustments were an integral part of that proposal. And one of the things I proposed was to create a soundscape, which was part audio guide, part audio description. I went to see Leah's show at South Kiosk Gallery, which was like the end of 2022, beginning of 2023. And Leah had told me that she was doing alt text. So I don't know why, but I thought of that as written alt text, which then the way that is translated into audio is generally through text to speech software that someone might have on their phone or computer. But it was this audio description soundscape in the room. And again, instead of having this experience going into this room of like, oh shit, Leah's done it, so I can't do it, I sent her a message being like, oh my God, you did this. I've been thinking about doing this too. And then it's this, exciting thing where we get to talk about the different approaches. And what I'll talk about in more detail later on is the sense that those works are distinct, our approaches are distinct, but my soundscape became better, both for me in terms of my access adjustments, but also I think in terms of the experience of it, because I'd heard Leah's soundscape. So, I think in many ways my personal thinking around the ways that culture and art is created and disseminated is that nothing is necessarily original. We are all made up of all of the many, many reference points. So I don't necessarily believe that things can be like the absolute first. But I think that what's more interesting than that is not for me to go like, oh, I've made this soundscape and like it was my idea and I'm precious about that, and like don't look at anyone else's soundscapes, is instead to be referential of the many different artists that have influenced where you've got to, and to show it in that way, to like show your line of thinking. And when you're doing that through access adjustments and disability, well, that just becomes a way of building resources essentially. So I can go, maybe you're hearing this audio guide, audio description through me, and maybe you haven't experienced that before, but look, other artists have done it too. And if you go and you look at their shows and their artworks and their ways of doing it, you're going to get this like huge breadth of different approaches that might help you figure out your own way through that. So when I'm sharing these things with you as well, I mean, I am of the opinion that having access adjustments as a creative practice, whether you're a disabled or abled artist, is something that is really, really creatively rich and fruitful. It both opens out your artworks to so many more people and so many more audiences, but it also helps you to understand your own practice and the different like ways through your practice in an interesting way. This is a show that was at Bethlehem Gallery in 2023. It's the first time I've seen this done. I mean, I saw a show at London Gallery with Liz Johnson Arter, which had like photo albums that you could look through. And I know that I don't, if you don't know that the photographer Liz Johnson Arter, she's somebody that has kind of documented and taken photos of a lot of kind of dance and music and fashion kind of circles in London and globally. Um, and a lot of Liz's practices through these physical archives, like she has masses of photo albums, like handmade photo albums with different materials and stuff in her home, which like in her home studio kind of thing. Um, and I know that with that show, there was this question that often comes up of like, we can't let people touch it. Like, as an institution, we can't let people touch your work because they're gonna, what if they damage it? And there's a lot of pushback if you ever are working in a kind of public organization in this way. Like, there can be pushback of the institutional organization actually saying, like, okay, you might want your work to be touched, but like, that's not how we do it here. Well, this is a show which is designed to be touched. So it's this artist, Keith Clapson, over 100 ceramic sculptures, and visitors were invited to touch selected pieces. So there is this sense of moving around and actually having this touch experience. And I know that as I mean, I don't know if it's because I'm autistic, but like I definitely like experience the world through different sensory experiences, and like I like touch as a way of understanding things sometimes, and like different textures. And I feel intensely frustrated a lot of the time by not being able to touch artworks. Like, maybe that's why I started making art myself, so I could actually touch the mediums and works that I was working with. But I think when something is so physical in that way, that there is something about touch that really helps you understand something different about the work. And as somebody that might not experience the world through sight, for whatever reason that is, which there are many, touch with something that can be as physical as art making can be a really beautiful way to still understand that. So this show actually allows people to do that, which goes back to this idea that Lazard talks about of not privileging sight. I'm just gonna briefly talk you through a couple of artworks that I've made and the creative access adjustments. So the first work is one called An Echo for My Father. This is actually the first work I made moving into like visual art making. It's it's the first film in a series of which is intended to be three, about my relationship with my dad, who was a South African jazz musician who died when I was 3. The first film starts with this idea of absence, kind of contextualizing where I'm at when I start making the series. So what it means to have an absent parent through death and lose access to one side of your heritage. And one of the things that happens in this film is that well, initially what it began with was that I knew that I wanted to have this kind of touchstone of where I was at before the process had started. So I created this, like really haphazardly created this stream of consciousness, a recorded audio of me just talking about my feelings with my dad, which are things that have been largely not looked at and kind of repressed. So it's quite a garbled, I think, yeah, about half an hour stream of consciousness, which we then, well, I personally, as someone making this work, clung to as the kind of overriding framework for the film. So when we were making it, the audio that I'd recorded ended up being edited down, and it ended up being the kind of soundtrack and score to the film. And then simultaneously, one of the things that happens in the film is that I record myself listening to my dad's music for the first time in real time. I had never heard it, because he wasn't really a part of like my consciousness and like the way I was raised. And I didn't realize until I was listening to one of his records, but he was a composer and he wrote the music too, but he also, he was a jazz fusion musician. So I was expecting it to all be instrumental, but there are lyrics and he sings. And one of the tracks is like really, really pertinent to like what I was experiencing. And it ended up feeling like this kind of communication that was happening beyond the grave. Um, and so when I finished like the first edit of the film, I sent it to my friend, the curator and film researcher and writer Gemma Desai, and she said to me, it still had this stream of consciousness audible throughout, and she said to me like it's so exposing and it's so like vulnerable and there's this like intense sincerity to it. And some people will be freaked out by that because it's already such a vulnerable work. Like it will be too much for some audiences. But also in the name of self-preservation, you don't have to give all of yourself away. You can hold some stuff back for yourself, which is something that I still think about a lot as somebody that makes work about their own experiences and identity. And her advice was to take out the audio and translate it into captions. And Gemma had also seen some that was really, really interesting and sent it to me to give me this idea of like different approaches that were taking place, both in art, but also like within the wider film sector around creative closed captioning. It's like a really rich thing to delve into, different people's approaches. So she was like, look at this, look at what it kind of gives to the work. And so I I transcribed the audio, and then from there it was easier to just like cut chunks of it out. So it kind of has a lot more gaps and silences in it. And we were also thinking about the sense of like how the gaps and silences in the film, in the visuals, in the audio, which then were captions, was a way of kind of echoing this contextualization of absence that the whole film is about. But what happened in the translation of that into closed captions, which, as you can hear from the way I'm describing it, was not intended as an access adjustment in any way. It was a creative decision. It then created this opportunity to have a call and response between my kind of voice and like written voice and my dad's lyrics, which the score ended up being a reinterpretation of my dad's music by the video editor and DOP and sound artist who I was working with, who is also a jazz musician, a contemporary jazz musician. And so you get this kind of strange, like echoey rendition of my dad's music, but then you also get it underlined more clearly of like being able to read what is being played of his lyrics at the top of the screen. So you have mine at the bottom which references the fact that I'm grounded in the living realm, and his at the top, in the sense of like coming from the afterlife and above in some way, from the atmosphere. And you get this call and response, which wouldn't have happened unless it was in the same way, unless it was captions. So this is before I was really thinking about creative access adjustments. And you can see there that like the closed captioning gives the film a completely different approach. And I guess this is what happens a lot of the time. It's like thinking about what happens when you get like block or you get stuck with an idea. Well, then what happens when you bring creative access adjustments into it as another way to kind of communicate, another language to use? Well, it kind of opens out and extends this whole other route and whole other path to take in a really interesting way. There's a clip of it online if you were interested in seeing. So this is the first work that I made that really explicitly referenced disability that was informed by research I'd been doing for a number of years. It's called Crip Quilt. It is a large-scale patchwork textile quilt made across 15 months. Each square in the quilt translates a different experience in a disabled artist's journey, both my own and then from oral histories in the National Disability Art Collection and Archive, which the work was made in response to, and then also 3 new collated oral histories with disabled artists of colour, which was a gap that we identified in Indaka's archive, that there weren't many artists of colour. And so then the creative access adjustments of this quilt were kind of a part of it from its conception. It was always imagined with creative access adjustments as part of it. So there is this soundscape that is intended to be played out loud, and if it can be, but like it has so far been played in headphones because of bleed with other works. That is part audio description, so describing the visuals of the squares in words, like audibly instead. And as you can see from this, like, I mean, I made this work through disability. Like, I was bedbound a lot of the time. It was made from bed. I am not like, I'm a self-trained artist. I'm not an embroiderer. Like, this is the first time I've worked with textiles. The legibility of them changes. So the ones made at the beginning are a lot harder to read. There's one that's kind of like second row from the right, 3 down, which has like my handwriting, which is kind of joined up, so like this cursive writing, really, really difficult to read. So actually the audio does create a kind of, it helps with the legibility of the quilt in itself. And then it's part audio guide. So it with my own squares, it describes the background behind them. It might describe some of the creative choices behind them, but also the story behind them. And then with the oral histories, it kind of puts in place a clip of them. I'll play you a clip.
Outstretched across the patch is an open hand, facing upwards, complete with lifelines stitched onto it. It is pale pink and drawn with a running stitch to make the outline. In the palm of the hand are the outlines of small people in white thread. The text below the hand reads, "I wish I could shrink my loved ones to pocket size so I could get them out and talk to them whenever I want." Once again, thinking from the confines of her home and bed, Jamila imagined what it would be like to have her loved ones as pocket-sized companions, so she was never alone. She has felt continually frustrated at the geographical distance between her and the people in her life, and how challenging it is to bridge that distance as a disabled person. This is the patch Jamila was stitching when her grandmother died in October 2022. She showed it to her grandma on the last day she was alive, and said how she wished she could shrink her and her mum down and carry them around in her pocket. Her grandma found this funny, and they stitched together in her front room. Her grandma full of life, only to pass on that same evening. When Jamila looks at the patch, she thinks fondly of that day and her grandma.
So if you want to hear more, there are more clips in this presentation and you have access to it as well. But what the intention is that this is something that can be experienced by everyone, that you might listen to it as somebody that doesn't need audio description and not be fully aware that you're listening to audio description. But what it shows us is the breadth of experiencing a work through a different sensory experience. And in doing that, it's kind of like underlining all of the things that might be possible if this was just integrated into artistic practice, and it is, I don't think it's the responsibility of artists to put access adjustments to their works. I do think that, like, institutions and organizations should have a standard practice for all of those things. But whichever approach is taken to it, whether it's done by the artist or it's done externally, something is opened up when we do that. And then this moving image work, which I'm not going to play for you, but is essentially filming the work in situ in space in a space, and then close-ups of it, and then the soundtrack to that moving image work is a kind of clip of the soundscape. So really simple to make, actually, but tries to translate this experience of moving around the quilt, of like the different kind of perspectives that you might look at, so that then it can be viewed viewed remotely. That one of the things that I think is really worth considering, like I'm thinking about what we've been thinking about is creative access adjustments in relation to how other people experience work. But one of the things about being a disabled artist, but also any artist, like all of us do have access needs, and whether that's caring responsibilities, illness, whether that's temporary or long term, like whatever it is, financial differences, like all of those things, we all have our own access needs. And so one of the other things to think about is like creating through access adjustments, like what are the access adjustments you need to maintain a creative practice. So when I was making this work Crip Quilt, as I said, like it was made from predominantly from bed, but also in the sense of having portable, like small squares I could take around with me. It was also made on trains. It was made during like gallery openings, which for the most part I never go to, but it created like something I could do with my hands to like distract from having to have social interactions, which I can find challenging. Um, but that it was something that enabled me to keep doing things, to keep imagining at a point where like I was really limited in what I could do. This work that I made, Spoons After Carolyn Lazard, which is also available online, um, the basis of it and the kind of score that is made is voice notes that I exchanged with three disabled artists, so Leah and Carolyn, who I've mentioned, and Bella Milroy, who I mentioned briefly, over 6 months. And so we did that whenever we could get to it. Like it was really free flowing. One of the people that I'm always really think about in terms of access adjustments for creating is Frida Kahlo, who had like disability after having an accident, and did a lot of work from bed. So Frida created a kind of bed easel and painted from bed, which is something that I live with my mum, who is my carer, kept saying to my mum, she's also an artist, like, I want a bed easel. And she was like, it's a step too far. You can't bring your messy practice into your bed. Like more like, textiles aren't messy, thankfully. But it's something that I did over the winter holidays, and like brought a bed easel into my bed, which I'm now regretting because I now have back problems. But like there are all of these workarounds. I think this is a thing when you're thinking imaginatively, and being able to do that as an artist is a really beautiful and like privileged space to be in, to just like have that space to imagine and be curious and think. We can also be really creative and curious about the kind of ways that we create, so that we can keep doing it even when things are even when our life changes. Like we can never predict those things. And one of the things with disability is that at some point in our lives, most of us will experience disability or care for someone who is disabled. Like it is actually such a integral part of living. Um, it just isn't seen that way within society, and it is something that is really kind of like pushed to the sideline, and like I think is associated with death and dying for the most part, which in this part of the world we aren't very accepting of, or we don't really have a really clear relationship with mortality. So it's not something that is kind of spoken about in a expansive way. But disability doesn't mean like it's not a life sentence. It isn't like it doesn't mean that all of the color drains out of your life, which is what you might think if you go to things like mobility shops, which are like grey, horrible spaces. Like actually, there is still so much expansiveness, and you can still live such an expansive life. And part of that is about being creative about the adjustments that you build in place for yourself. So, you can think about that in any way with creating. Like sometimes you might be doing something for a while that then no longer works for you. One of my oldest friends is a painter, and she has been painting since we were like 14. So like, um, about 15 years now, and she developed repetitive strain in her wrist from painting at one point. And it's she still continues to paint now, but we have these moments occasionally where the things that the methods that we've been working through no longer serve us. And then it's like, instead of going, I can't do anything, it's thinking like, what is actually possible within this new reality? And that actually making sometimes ends up being a way to like maintain your sanity, or like maintain a sense of expression. And that can be really, really healing too. So to like not take all of those things away completely can be really beautiful.